When the perfect predator crawls into hell itself, even demons learn to fear the dark. The walls pulse, the air tastes like acid and ash, and something is evolving faster than hell can kill it. So what happens when the ultimate hunter becomes the prey and neither one knows how to stop? The derelict research vessel tumbled through the void like a dying insect, its hull breached and bleeding atmosphere into the cold. It had been named Covenant's Promise by Weyland-Yutani executives who believed in profit more than prophecy, but the name meant nothing now. The ship had torn through hyperspace incorrectly, its FTL drive malfunctioning in ways the navigation AI could not explain, and emerged in a region of space that should not have existed. The sensors screamed warnings about gravitational anomalies, dimensional bleeding, and radiation signatures that matched no known stellar phenomena. Before the automated distress beacon could finish its first cycle, the ship's orbit decayed, and it fell toward a moon that glowed the color of dried blood. Phobos waited below, its surface pocked with industrial installations that had long since been abandoned or repurposed for darker sciences. The UAC had built its empire here once, drilling into Mars and its satellites with the fervor of prophet-seeking God. They had found something else instead. The ship struck the northern wastes of the moon with enough force to scatter its cargo across kilometers of rust-colored regolith. Cryopods shattered on impact. Supply crates burst open, spilling medical equipment and weapons into craters that still bore scorch marks from ancient battles. And in the ship's biocontainment hold, where temperature and atmosphere had been carefully regulated for months of deep space travel, dozens of leathery eggs cracked open in the sudden cold. The facehuggers died within seconds, their bodies freezing solid before they could draw breath. But the eggs themselves, crafted by evolution into perfect survival vessels, detected the warmth still radiating from the ship's failing reactor. They pulsed with alien life, waiting. And beneath the surface of Phobos, in tunnels that descended into dimensions mankind had tried desperately to seal, something else stirred. The demons of hell had never fully abandoned this place. They moved through the lower excavations like blood through veins, and when the ship's reactor finally breached and flooded an entire section with heat and light, they came to investigate. The imp called Gearvac had served the legions for 3 centuries, ever since his mortal death had condemned him to an eternity of service. He was small by demonic standards, barely taller than a human man, his flesh the color of cooling magma and covered in ritual scars that proclaimed his minor rank. He had been part of the occupation force that had tried to hold Phobos when the Slayer had come through like a blade of light, and he had survived only by hiding in a maintenance shaft while his betters were torn apart. The memory of that day still haunted him, not with fear but with a kind of religious awe. He had seen the face of divine wrath, and it had chosen to pass him by. Now Gearvac picked through the wreckage of the crashed ship with 6 others of his kind, all of them drawn by the heat and the possibility of salvage. The UAC had learned to seal their facilities with sigils and wards that burned demon flesh, but this ship carried no such protections. Its corridors were dark and empty, lit only by emergency strips that pulsed with fading power. Gearvac's claws scraped against metal flooring as he descended into the biocontainment hold, his nostrils flaring at a scent he did not recognize. It was organic, but wrong, acidic and sharp in a way that made his throat close. The eggs waited in rows, each one as tall as his torso and ribbed with biomechanical perfection. They had been stored in climate-controlled chambers, but the crash had torn those systems apart. Now they sat in pools of coolant and leaked fluids, their leathery surfaces moving with slow, rhythmic contractions. Gearvac approached the nearest one with caution, his head tilted as he studied the cross-shaped opening at its crown. He could feel heat radiating from within, could sense something alive and waiting. His hand extended, claws scraping against the egg's surface. The facehugger launched with the speed of a striking serpent, its pale body uncoiling as it leaped toward Gearvac's face. He stumbled backward with a shriek, his claws slashing through the air, but the creature moved with precision born from millions of years of evolution. It latched onto his skull, its tail whipping around his throat with crushing force, its legs gripping with strength that exceeded any muscle structure its size should possess. Girvak fell backward, crashing into a cargo container as his hands clawed at the thing suffocating him. His companions rushed forward, tearing at the facehugger with claws and teeth. But its exoskeleton resisted their attacks. One imp managed to pry loose a leg, and where its claws punctured the creature's flesh, acid sprayed outward in a hissing stream. The acid ate through demonic hide like prayer through sin. The imp howled and fell away, clutching at a face that was melting into slag. Another tried to pull the tail from Girvak's throat and lost 3 fingers to the acid that spurted from the wound. The facehugger held on with implacable determination, its proboscis forcing itself past Girvak's jaws and down into his throat. His body convulsed once, twice, and then went still. His eyes remained open, staring at nothing. As the creature completed its purpose and released its grip, it fell away from his face and crawled into the shadows, its body already dying, its mission complete. For 73 seconds, nothing happened. Girvak's companions dragged his unconscious body back toward the surface, arguing in the guttural language of hell about what they had witnessed. They had seen possession before, had watched humans and animals alike become hosts for demonic corruption, but this felt different. This felt surgical. When they emerged into the thin atmosphere of Phobos, dragging Girvak behind them, they did not notice the way his chest had begun to swell. They did not see the small movements beneath his ribs, the subtle bulging that spoke of something growing inside him at an impossible rate. The chestburster erupted 6 hours later, while Girvak lay in a holding pen with 24 other minor demons. It tore through his sternum with a shriek that was almost musical, a sound that combined the hiss of escaping steam with the cry of a newborn predator. The creature that emerged was no larger than a man's forearm, its body segmented and glistening with fluids that steamed in the cold air. But it was not fully xenomorph. Its flesh bore the texture of demonic hide, rough and scarred, and along its skull ran patterns that resembled the ritual markings Girvak had carved into his own body. Where its blood should have been acid alone, it glowed with a faint red luminescence, the unmistakable signature of argent energy. The hybrid moved with terrifying speed, its body uncoiling like a whip as it launched itself at the nearest imp, its jaws extended, the inner mouth punching through the demon's eye socket and into its brain with the efficiency of an execution. The victim fell without a sound, and the hybrid was already moving, already growing, its body absorbing the infernal energy that suffused every atom of hell's architecture. Within seconds it had doubled in size. Within minutes it stood as tall as a man, its elongated skull gleaming with runes that had not been there before, its tail tipped with a blade-like point that dripped both acid and hellfire. The massacre in the holding pen lasted less than 3 minutes. When the overseers arrived, drawn by the screams, they found 23 demons torn apart with surgical precision. The hybrid had vanished into the ventilation system, leaving behind only acid burns and the lingering smell of corrupted flesh. The overseers reported the incident to their superiors, who reported it to the barons, who reported it to the priests of the dark temples. And in those temples, where the walls were made from compressed suffering and the air tasted of old blood, the elders consulted their archives and found nothing that matched what had been described. On the surface of Phobos, in the wreckage of the Covenant's promise, the remaining eggs continued to wait. Demons came in greater numbers now, drawn by rumors of salvage and by the territorial instinct that drove them to investigate any intrusion into their domain. They found the bio-containment hold and its rows of patient vessels. They approached with caution, having heard whispers of what had happened to Girvak, but greed and curiosity overrode fear. The eggs opened for them one by one, and the facehuggers performed their function with mechanical inevitability. Within a day, 15 more hybrids had been born. Within a week, the number had tripled. The creatures learned quickly, their intelligence a terrifying fusion of xenomorph instinct and demonic cunning. They began to hunt in coordinated packs, using the tunnel networks beneath Phobos as their hive. They dragged their victims back to the crashed ship, which they had claimed as their nest, and built walls from secreted resin that hardened into structures stronger than steel. The resin itself was transformed by its contact with Hell's essence, taking on properties that defied analysis. It absorbed Argent energy like a sponge, storing it within its crystalline matrix, and any demon that touched it found their strength drained away as if siphoned into the walls themselves. The UAC became aware of the infestation when a research team on Mars detected unusual energy readings emanating from Phobos. The readings suggested a massive buildup of Argent energy in a location that should have been dormant, a dead zone sealed after the Slayer's last crusade. Director Samson Pierce authorized a reconnaissance mission, sending a squad of 12 elite soldiers equipped with plasma rifles and wearing armor that had been blessed by the Sentinel priests. They landed on Phobos 3 weeks after the Covenant's promise had crashed, and they found Hell's occupation force in chaos. The demons were being hunted. The soldiers found evidence of battles everywhere they looked, acid burns on metal walls, demonic corpses torn apart with precision, entire patrols missing with only bloodstains to mark their passing. The few demons they encountered were fleeing, running toward the sealed portals that led back to Hell's deeper layers, and they barely acknowledged the humans before disappearing into the dark. The soldiers pressed forward, following the energy readings to their source, and found the crashed ship transformed into something that should not exist. The hive sprawled across 1/2 kilometer, its resin walls pulsing with captured Argent light. The architecture combined the biomechanical aesthetic of xenomorph construction with the geometric brutality of Hell's design, creating structures that seemed to breathe and bleed in equal measure. The soldiers approached with weapons raised, their helmet displays flickering with warnings about toxic atmosphere and radiation spikes. They made it 30 meters into the hive before the hybrids attacked. The creatures came from every direction at once, emerging from vents and ceiling spaces with coordinated precision. They moved too fast for human reflexes, their bodies flowing like liquid as they closed the distance. The plasma rifles fired in controlled bursts, each shot powerful enough to vaporize an imp, but the hybrids learned from every death. They used the walls as shields. They flanked and feinted. They targeted the soldiers' weak points with the analytical precision of a surgical AI. When the acid began to spray, eating through armor seals and melting flesh beneath, the screams lasted only seconds before being cut short. One soldier survived long enough to transmit a final message. His voice was steady despite the sounds of his squad dying around him, despite the hissing that grew louder with each word. He reported the presence of at least 40 contacts, all exhibiting characteristics consistent with both xenomorph and demonic physiology. He reported that conventional weapons were insufficient. He reported that the creatures were building something in the heart of the hive, something that pulsed with enough Argent energy to power a city. Then his transmission cut to static, and Mars Control heard nothing but the sound of tearing metal. Director Pierce sealed the data and sent an emergency request to the Sentinel Guard, asking for immediate intervention. The Sentinels had fought beside humanity during the last Hell invasion, their ancient warriors wielding technology that bridged the gap between magic and science, and they alone possessed the knowledge to combat threats that transcended conventional warfare. The response came within hours, delivered by a Sentinel commander whose armor bore the scars of 1,000 battles. His message was brief and carried the weight of absolute authority. The Slayer had been awakened. He was coming to Phobos. The Doomslayer walked through the Mars orbital station like a force of nature contained in human form. his armor gleaming with power that made the air around him shimmer with heat distortion. He moved with purpose, but without haste, each step measured and inevitable, and the soldiers who saw him pass felt both terror and hope in equal measure. They had heard the stories, had seen the footage of his previous campaigns, but nothing prepared them for the reality of his presence. He was not large by demonic standards, standing barely over 6 feet tall, but he carried himself with the density of a collapsing star. His armor, green and bronze and scarred by weapons that could crack mountains, seemed to drink in the light around him and reflect it back as something harder, something that hurt to look at directly. Director Pierce met him in the briefing room, surrounded by holographic displays that showed real-time footage of Phobos and the spreading infestation. Pierce was a career military man, decorated in 3 wars, but his hands shook as he gestured to the displays. He tried to explain what the UAC knew about the Xenomorphs, tried to outline their biology and their life cycle, tried to convey the danger posed by their fusion with Hell's essence. The Slayer stood in silence, his helmet's visor reflecting the swirling holograms, and when Pierce finally stopped talking, the Slayer reached out and tapped a single icon on the display. It was the last transmission from the recon team, the audio file that captured their final moments. The Slayer listened to it once. That was enough. He turned without a word and left the briefing room, his boots ringing against the metal floor with the cadence of a funeral march. Pierce tried to follow, tried to offer additional support or resources, but the Slayer waved him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. He walked alone to the launch bay where a combat shuttle waited, its engines already cycling to full power. The pilot, a woman who had flown supply runs to Hell's border and survived, looked at the Slayer as he boarded and felt her training desert her. She asked if he needed anything. The Slayer touched a control panel on his wrist, and a holographic list appeared in the air between them. It showed ammunition types, weapon configurations, and a single additional item, a Sentinel hammer stored in the station's armory since the last crusade. The pilot nodded and relayed the request. 20 minutes later, when the shuttle launched toward Phobos, the hammer sat secured in the cargo bay, its head etched with runes that had been old when humanity was young. The Slayer stood in the passenger compartment, checking his weapons with methodical care. The super shotgun, twin barrels engraved with prayers. The ballista, its energy coils humming with captured starlight. The crucible blade, dormant but ready, its hilt warm against his palm. The approach to Phobos revealed the scope of the infestation in ways that surveillance imagery could not capture. The northern hemisphere of the moon had been transformed into an organism, its surface now covered in resin structures that pulsed with bioluminescent light. Entire sections of the old UAC installations had been consumed and rebuilt, their industrial architecture merged with something organic and alive. The crashed ship sat at the center like a tumor, its hull now barely visible beneath layers of hardened secretion, and from deep within that mass, an energy signature bloomed like a second sun, too bright and too wrong to be anything natural. The shuttle landed 3 kilometers from the hive's edge, touching down in a crater that had once housed a communications relay. The pilot looked back as the Slayer prepared to disembark, her face pale in the red light filtering through the windows. She asked if he wanted her to wait, if he needed extraction support, if there was anything she could do. The Slayer loaded a shell into the super shotgun, the sound of metal against metal ringing in the confined space, and stepped out onto the surface of Phobos. The shuttle lifted off immediately, its engines burning hard as it climbed back toward orbit. The pilot did not look back. The Slayer walked across the scarlet dust, his armor's seals hissing as they adjusted to the thin atmosphere. The temperature was -70 degrees, cold enough to kill an unprotected human in seconds, but the suit's climate systems kept him warm. His heads-up display tracked movement in the distance, thermal signatures that flickered and disappeared too quickly for standard analysis. He knew that pattern. He had seen it in the jungles of hell, in the UAC facilities on Earth, in 100 battlegrounds across as many dimensions. He was being watched, evaluated, measured for weaknesses that did not exist. The first hybrid struck when he was halfway to the hive, launching itself from a buried position with enough force to crack the ground beneath its feet. It was fully grown, 8 feet of corded muscle and chitin armor, its elongated skull marked with glowing runes that spelled out words in a language older than human civilization. The Slayer pivoted, the super shotgun coming up in a single fluid motion, and fired both barrels at point-blank range. The slug impact vaporized the hybrid's torso, scattering its remains across 10 meters of regolith. Acid and argent-charged blood sprayed outward, eating craters into the ground. But the Slayer had already moved, his armor's reactive coating shedding the droplets before they could penetrate. 3 more hybrids emerged from concealment, moving in a coordinated pattern that spoke of intelligence and tactical awareness. They did not charge blindly, but circled, testing his defenses, looking for openings. The Slayer loaded 2 more shells and fired at the nearest target, but the creature twisted in mid-air, its body bending at angles that defied skeletal structure. The shot grazed its shoulder, tearing away a chunk of chitin and flesh, but it completed its movement and landed behind a rock formation. The others pressed their advantage, one feinting left while the other committed to a full assault from the right. The Slayer dropped the shotgun and drew the ballista in the same motion, the weapon charging with a sound like tearing silk. He fired into the advancing hybrid's skull, the energy bolt punching through bone and brain matter before detonating with enough force to collapse the creature's entire upper body. The third hybrid reached him before he could acquire the next target, its claws raking across his armor with sparks that lit the dim landscape. The Slayer caught its arm mid-strike, his gauntleted fist closing around the limb with hydraulic force that splintered bone. He yanked the hybrid forward and brought his helmet down against its skull in a headbutt that would have shattered concrete. The creature's head cratered inward, its body going limp, and the Slayer threw it aside as he retrieved the super shotgun. The wounded hybrid attempted to flee, its body trailing acid blood as it scrambled toward the hive. The Slayer tracked it calmly, loaded a single shell, and fired. The creature's spine detonated in a spray of bone fragments and glowing fluids, and it collapsed mid-stride, twitching. The Slayer walked to each corpse and examined them with clinical attention, his helmet's sensors recording anatomical data and transmitting it back to the orbital station. These were not simple xenomorphs. Their cellular structure incorporated demonic matter at a fundamental level, their acid blood enhanced with argent energy that made it far more corrosive than the baseline strain, and the runes carved into their flesh were not decorative. They functioned as organic circuitry, channeling and storing energy in ways that suggested deliberate evolution. Something had changed these creatures. Something had pushed them beyond their natural apex. The Slayer continued toward the hive, encountering resistance every 100 meters. The hybrids attacked in waves, each assault more coordinated than the last, each creature learning from the deaths of its predecessors. They used the terrain, they flanked, they created kill zones with acid blood spilled in choke points. But the Slayer adapted faster, his combat algorithms refined by eons of warfare against enemies that wielded reality itself as a weapon. He switched between weapons with seamless efficiency, using the ballista for precision kills and the shotgun for close encounters, and when the hybrids tried to swarm him in numbers, he triggered the flame belch and turned the battlefield into an inferno. The fire adhered to the hybrids' chitin armor, burning with chemical intensity that made their bodies glow like lanterns. They shrieked and thrashed, their acid blood boiling in their veins, and the Slayer walked through the carnage without pause. Armor fragments scattered from fallen enemies, their crystallized argent energy cores absorbed by his suit's systems, refueling him even as he killed. This was the nightmare mathematics of his existence. He grew stronger with every death, his ammunition replenished by the bodies of his enemies, his health sustained by the fury of battle itself. He was a perpetual motion machine powered by violence, and the hybrids could not break that cycle. The hive entrance loomed before him, a massive opening in the resin superstructure that breathed humid air filled with spores and chemical signals. The walls pulsed with bioluminescence, veins of captured argent energy running through the organic material like circuitry through silicon. The Slayer paused at the threshold, his sensors detecting dozens of signatures deeper within, all moving with purposeful coordination. This was no longer a nest. This had become something closer to a military installation, designed and defended by intelligence that exceeded simple predatory instinct. He drew the crucible, and its blade ignited with light that pushed back the darkness. The energy field surrounding the weapon hummed with power drawn from dimensions where physics bowed to will, and the resin walls nearest to him began to smoke and char from proximity alone. The Slayer stepped into the hive, and the walls seemed to contract around him, the organic architecture recognizing a threat to its existence. From deep within, a sound began to build, a chorus of hisses and screams that rose in volume until it became a physical force. The hybrids were calling to each other, spreading word of the intruder, mobilizing their entire population for war. The tunnels twisted through the hive like intestines, their walls coated in secretions that reflected his helmet lights in oil-slick rainbows. The Slayer moved through them with the crucible held low, its blade cutting through support structures and causing sections of tunnel to collapse behind him. He was sealing his own path, ensuring that reinforcements could not surround him, forcing the hybrids to commit to frontal assaults. They came in groups of 6 or 8, dropping from ceiling spaces or erupting from side chambers, and the crucible reduced them to ash with each swing. The blade cut through their acid blood without resistance, the energy field vaporizing the fluids before they could spray, and the Slayer advanced through a storm of disintegrating bodies. Deeper in the hive, he found the first holding chambers, vast spaces where victims had been cocooned and prepared for impregnation. The bodies were a mixture of demons and humans, all suspended in resin that kept them alive but comatose. Their chests bulged with the shapes of developing chestbursters, some already stirring with imminent birth. The Slayer raised the ballista and fired methodically, each shot igniting a cocoon and the creature within. The explosions filled the chamber with burning fragments and the screams of things that had never been fully born, and when the last cocoon fell silent, he moved on without looking back. The architecture changed as he descended, the organic structures giving way to something more deliberate and geometric. The walls here were reinforced with metal torn from the crashed ship and the old UAC installations, welded together with resin that had hardened into a substance approaching steel in strength. And everywhere, carved into every surface, were runes. They covered the walls in spiraling patterns, each one channeling argent energy through the hive's infrastructure like a nervous system. The Slayer stopped before one particularly large rune, his helmet analyzing its structure, and his systems identified it as a modified version of a maker power conduit. Somehow, the hybrids had learned to manipulate Hell's own energy architecture. He found the source in the hive's deepest chamber, a cathedral-sized space that had been carved from Phobos's bedrock and expanded with the crashed ship's fusion reactor at its heart. The reactor still functioned, captured and repurposed by the hive, its core now wrapped in layers of resin that pulsed with synchronized rhythm. The energy it generated was being channeled through thousands of runes into a structure that dominated the chamber's center. It was an egg, but one that dwarfed all others. Easily 30 feet tall and surrounded by a moat of acid that bubbled with volcanic heat. The surface of the egg was black as void and covered in runes that blazed with light too intense to look at directly. The queen was gestating inside, her form still developing but already massive enough that her silhouette was visible through the translucent shell. She was not merely a xenomorph queen corrupted by Hell's influence. She was something new, a synthesis of apex predator biology and demonic essence, and her emergence would create a creature capable of challenging Hell's own hierarchy. The Slayer understood immediately why the demons had fled, why even the barons had abandoned their positions on Phobos. This thing, once born, would not serve the Dark Lord. It would replace him. The chamber erupted with movement as every hybrid in the hive converged on his position. They poured from tunnels and dropped from overhead structures, a living tide of chitin and rage that filled the space with their bodies. The Slayer deactivated the crucible and drew the sentinel hammer, its head erupting with gravitational force that distorted the air itself. He swung in a wide arc, and the shockwave that followed broke bone and pulped flesh across a 40-foot radius. Hybrids were hurled backward into walls with enough force to splatter, and those that remained charged through the corpses of their kin. The battle became a whirlwind of motion and violence, each second compressed with exchanges that would have overwhelmed any other combatant. The Slayer moved through the swarm like a blade through water, the hammer rising and falling with metronomic precision. Each impact shattered bodies and sent gravitational pulses through the hive structure, causing support beams to crack and sections of ceiling to rain down in chunks. The hybrids adapted, targeting his joints and seals, trying to find weaknesses through coordinated strikes from multiple angles. 3 of them succeeded in breaching his left shoulder armor, their claws tearing through the outer layer before his reactive systems could compensate. The Slayer felt the pain as a distant sensation, his nervous system flooded with combat stimulants that pushed agony into a space where it could not touch him. He pivoted, using the hammer to sweep 2 hybrids into the acid moat where they dissolved screaming, then grabbed the third by its skull and drove it face first into the ground with enough force to crater the stone. He spun and fired the super shotgun one-handed, the recoil absorbed by servos in his armor, and a hybrid that had been mid-leap came apart in segments. The bodies piled around him, the acid blood forming pools that his boots sizzled through, and still they came. A new sound cut through the battle noise, a shriek that resonated at frequencies that made the chamber itself vibrate. The egg at the chamber's center was splitting, its shell peeling back like flower petals to reveal the queen within. She was immense, her body still wet with birth fluids, but already powerful enough that her movements shook the floor. Her skull was elongated to the point of abstraction, a blade of bone that stretched back 4 feet and blazed with runes from base to crown. Her body was armored in chitin plates that overlapped like scales, each one marked with demonic scripture, and her tail ended in a barbed stinger that dripped venom glowing with argent light. The queen rose to her full height, easily 25 feet tall, and the remaining hybrids fell back in perfect synchronization. They formed a defensive perimeter around her, their bodies oriented toward the Slayer with predatory focus. The queen herself studied him with eyes that reflected intelligence that transcended instinct, a consciousness that had absorbed knowledge from every demon she had consumed. She opened her jaws and spoke, not with words but with a psychic pressure that hammered against his mind like fists against a door. She showed him images, the death of worlds, the consumption of civilizations, the transformation of hell itself into a breeding ground for her children. She offered him a place in that future, a role as hunter rather than hunted. The Slayer responded by firing a ballista bolt directly at her skull. The shot struck her crown and detonated, tearing away a section of chitin armor and exposing bleeding flesh beneath. The queen shrieked and lunged forward with speed that defied her size, her claws raking through the space where the Slayer had been standing. He rolled beneath her strike and came up with the hammer, driving its head into her lower torso with force that lifted her front legs from the ground. She retaliated with her tail, the stinger punching through his right thigh armor and injecting venom that would have liquefied a human's internal organs in seconds. The Slayer's medical systems flooded his bloodstream with counteragents, neutralizing the venom before it could spread. But the damage had been done. The armor seal was breached, and he could feel cold air against exposed flesh. He yanked the stinger free and swung the hammer in a rising uppercut that caught the Queen under her jaw and snapped her head backward. She stumbled but did not fall, her body already adapting to his attack patterns, her movements becoming more defensive and calculated. The hybrid surged forward to support her, and the Slayer found himself fighting on two fronts, hammer and shotgun working in concert to hold back the tide while inflicting maximum damage on the Queen herself. The battle raged through the chamber, the Queen learning with every exchange, her tactics evolving from brute force to surgical precision. She used her children as shields and distractions, she targeted his damaged armor sections, she created openings and exploited them with the skill of a tactician trained in war. But the Slayer had fought gods and lived, had brought down entities that could rewrite reality with thought alone, and a Queen born from Hell's essence was still bound by physics he could manipulate. He waited for her to commit to a full assault, baited her with a feigned stumble, and when she lunged for what should have been a killing blow, he activated the crucible. The blade ignited in his left hand, its energy field expanding to full power in an instant, and he drove it upward into the Queen's descending jaws. The weapon punched through the roof of her mouth and into her brain cavity, the energy discharge cooking neural tissue and flash-boiling cerebral fluid. The Queen spasmed, her body convulsing with electrical fire, and the Slayer twisted the blade and pulled it free in a motion that opened her skull like a flower. She collapsed, her massive body slamming into the ground hard enough to crack stone, and black blood mixed with glowing argent fluids poured from the wound. The remaining hybrids froze, their collective consciousness severed by the death of their matriarch. For 3 seconds they stood motionless, their bodies locked in place by confusion and the sudden absence of command. Then they scattered, fleeing into the tunnels with mindless panic, their coordination shattered. The Slayer let them go. He walked to the fusion reactor at the chamber's heart, studying the way it had been incorporated into the hive's structure. The runes covering its surface were still active, still channeling power through networks that extended throughout the entire installation. He placed a charge at the base of the reactor, a shaped explosive calibrated to breach containment without triggering a catastrophic detonation. He had 11 minutes to reach the surface before the reactor failed and the resulting energy discharge sterilized every tunnel in the hive. The Slayer turned and walked back through the chamber, stepping over the Queen's corpse, and began his ascent through the collapsing structure. The tunnels shook as support systems failed, sections of ceiling dropping in, avalanches of resin and stone. The surviving hybrids fled past him in the darkness, too terrified to attack, their bodies driven by pure survival instinct. He reached the surface with 40 seconds to spare, emerging into the red light of Phobos just as the ground beneath him began to buckle. The reactor breach was not an explosion but an implosion, a gravitational collapse that sucked everything within half a kilometer into a singularity that lasted for 3 heartbeats before dissipating. The hive vanished into that void, along with every hybrid that had not escaped, along with the Queen's body and the thousands of eggs still waiting to hatch. When reality stabilized, there was only a crater where the infestation had been, a perfect sphere carved into Phobos's crust that glowed with residual heat. The Slayer stood at the crater's edge, his armor damaged but intact, and activated his communications system. Director Pierce's voice came through immediately, relief evident despite the static. He reported that thermal imaging showed no remaining signatures consistent with hybrid biology, that the infestation appeared to be contained. He asked if the Slayer required medical evacuation, if there were any casualties, if the mission was complete, The Slayer looked across the scarred landscape of Phobos at the distant lights of UAC installations that had survived by chance or providence, and considered the question. The Queen was dead. The primary hive was destroyed. But a dozen hybrids had escaped into the tunnels, and those tunnels connected to portals that led deeper into Hell's territory. The creatures were loose in dimensions where they could evolve and spread without limit. The Slayer did not respond to Pierce's questions. He checked his weapons, reloaded what needed reloading, and began walking toward the nearest portal entrance. Behind him, the crater continued to smoke, a scar on Phobos's face that would remain for 1,000 years. Above him, the shuttle descended from orbit, the pilot still hoping to extract him, still believing the mission was finished. But the Slayer had learned long ago that Hell's wars never ended, they only changed shape. The Xenomorphs had merged with demonic essence and become something that transcended both lineages. They would spread through Hell like cancer through flesh, and the Dark Lord himself might not be able to contain them, unless someone was willing to hunt them into extinction. Unless someone was willing to follow them into the deepest pits and kill every last hybrid, every last egg, every last trace of their existence. The Slayer descended into the portal, its energies washing over his armor like rain, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Mars Control received one final transmission before his signal disappeared into the dimensional static, a single word broadcast in the voice-synthesized monotone of his suit's communication system. Continuing, the war had not ended. It had only found a new front. In the blood jungles of Hell, where forests grew from calcified bone and rivers ran with souls dissolved to liquid, the surviving hybrids made their first kill. A Hell Night patrol, 6 warriors strong and armed with plasma cannons, encountered 3 of the creatures in a ravine lit by burning amber sky. The demons died without firing a shot, their bodies torn apart and dragged into the undergrowth before their commanders even knew they were under attack. By the time reinforcements arrived, the hybrids had vanished, leaving only acid burns and cocoons already gestating with new horrors. The Dark Lord received reports of the incursion with interest rather than fear. From his throne in Immora, the obsidian city at Hell's heart, he watched through scrying pools as the hybrids spread through his territories. They were killing his subjects, yes, but they were also revealing structural weaknesses in his defenses, exposing gaps in his surveillance networks. And they were fighting the Slayer, drawing his attention toward them and away from Immora itself. The Dark Lord saw opportunity in the chaos, saw the potential to let 2 apex predators destroy each other while he consolidated power. But one of his advisors, a Maker Angel corrupted and bound to Hell's service, warned against complacency. The hybrids were not simply killing, the advisor explained, they were learning. Every demon they consumed added knowledge to their collective consciousness, teaching them about Hell's geography, its politics, its power structures. And the argent energy they absorbed was changing them in ways that accelerated their evolution beyond anything biology alone could achieve. They were becoming something that Hell's natural order could not accommodate, something that threatened to upset the balance between creation and consumption that Hell represented. The Dark Lord considered this warning for exactly 7 seconds before dismissing the advisor. If the hybrids became too dangerous, he would simply exterminate them himself. Until then, they served a useful purpose. And if the Slayer destroyed them first, then Hell would be spared the effort. Either way, the Dark Lord saw no scenario in which he did not emerge victorious. His arrogance was absolute, refined by eons of ruling Hell's hierarchies, and he could not conceive of a threat that exceeded his capacity to destroy. The Slayer descended through 9 layers of Hell in pursuit of the scattered hybrids, his path marked by destroyed nests and burning corpses. He found the first major hive in the Kadingia Sanctum, where priests had once channeled argent energy to power Hell's invasion fleets. The hybrids had claimed the temple and converted it into a breeding ground, using the Sanctum's existing power conduits to accelerate their reproduction. The Slayer arrived to find 200 demons cocooned in the prayer halls, their bodies already hosting embryos that pulsed with synchronized heartbeats. He purged the temple with fire and explosive rounds, reducing the Sanctum to rubble and ash. The hybrids that tried to defend their territory died quickly, their tactics ineffective against an enemy who had fought his way through this location twice before and knew every choke point and sightline. But as the Slayer examined the remains, his helmet's analysis revealed something troubling. The hybrids here were different from those on Phobos, their biology further corrupted by prolonged exposure to Hell's environment. They had developed the ability to breathe hellfire, to channel Argent energy through their own bodies like living weapons. The evolution was accelerating, and it was directional. The Slayer tracked the remaining hybrids through the blood jungles, following trails of acid-scarred vegetation and butchered wildlife. The creatures were heading deeper, moving toward regions where reality itself began to fray, and where Hell's most ancient entities slept in prisons built before time had meaning. He intercepted the largest group in the Bone Plains, a wasteland of calcified remains that stretched to the horizon under skies that bled crimson light. 30 hybrids moved in formation across the landscape, their bodies now large enough to dwarf Hell Knights, their armor plated with chitin that had hardened into something approaching the density of Sentinel steel. The battle lasted 6 hours and covered 12 square miles. The hybrids fought with discipline that suggested military training, using the terrain to set ambushes and fallback positions, coordinating their attacks through psychic links that the Slayer's helmet could detect but not intercept. He killed them methodically, using long-range weapons to thin their numbers before closing for melee combat. But each kill came at a cost. His armor accumulated damage, seals breached and systems strained beyond their operational limits, and the hybrids grew bolder with each exchange, as if testing his capabilities, learning his patterns for some future engagement. When the last hybrid fell, its skull crushed beneath the Sentinel hammer, the Slayer stood alone on the Bone Plains and looked toward the horizon. Smoke rose from burning craters where explosions had sterilized entire sections of landscape, and the air tasted of ozone and acid. His suit's medical systems reported 3 cracked ribs, ruptured blood vessels in his left eye, and microfractures throughout his skeletal structure. Nothing fatal, nothing that would stop him. But the damage was accumulating faster than his enhanced healing could compensate, and he still had no clear count of how many hybrids remained loose in Hell. A portal opened nearby, its edges crackling with Maker energy, and through it stepped a figure the Slayer recognized immediately. The Seraph was ancient even by angelic standards, its armor white as starlight and carved with equations that described the fundamental structure of reality. It had fought beside the Slayer during the first war against Hell, had helped forge the Praetor suit that now kept him alive, and its presence here meant the situation had escalated beyond Hell's internal politics. The Seraph regarded him with eyes that held neither pity nor judgment, only acknowledgement of what he had become. It spoke in a voice like crystal harmonics, informing him that the Makers had been monitoring the hybrid infestation since its inception. The Khan Maker herself was concerned, the Seraph explained, not for Hell's sake but for the implications the hybrids represented. If creatures of pure biological origin could merge with demonic essence and survive, if they could harness Argent energy without corruption or madness, then the fundamental rules governing dimensional stability might be subject to revision. The hybrids were not simply monsters. They were proof that evolution could occur in directions the Makers had not anticipated, and that uncertainty was something Urdak could not tolerate. The Seraph extended a hand, and a hologram bloomed in the air between them. It showed Hell's deep core, the regions beneath even the Dark Lord's direct authority, where ancient structures predated Hell's current form. The hologram zoomed in on a facility that looked like a fusion of biomechanical architecture and something older, something that resembled neither human nor demon construction. The remaining hybrids were converging on that location, the Seraph explained, drawn by signals that should not exist. If they reached the facility and accessed whatever lay dormant inside, the consequences would extend beyond hell and threaten the multiverse itself. The Slayer listened in silence, his helmet's systems recording every detail of the hologram. When the Seraph finished speaking, he reached out and touched the image, causing it to expand and reveal interior schematics. The facility was vast, its corridors stretching through dimensions folded in on themselves, and at its heart sat something the scanners could not fully resolve. The Micras labeled it an archive, but the energy readings suggested something more organic than digital. The Slayer studied the structure for 30 seconds, committing every detail to memory, then looked at the Seraph and nodded once. The Seraph understood. It activated the portal again, this time calibrating the destination coordinates to place him directly at the facility's entrance. Before the Slayer stepped through, the Seraph spoke once more, its voice carrying a note of something that might have been regret. It told him that the Makras would not intervene directly, that this was a test of his capabilities and his commitment to multiversal stability. If he failed, if the hybrids successfully integrated with whatever intelligence resided in the archive, then Urdak would be forced to enact protocol erasure and destroy Hell entirely, collapsing its dimensional anchor and sending everything within its boundaries into non-existence. Billions of souls would be lost. Entire lineages of demons would cease to exist, and the Slayer himself, currently operating deep within Hell's territory, would be erased along with everything else. The Seraph did not ask if he understood these stakes. It simply waited for his response. The Slayer checked his ammunition one final time, verified that the crucible was fully charged, and walked through the portal without looking back. The Seraph watched him disappear, its expression unreadable, and then closed the portal behind him. What happened next would determine if Hell survived or if the multiverse lost one of its primary constants. The Slayer emerged in darkness so complete that even his helmet's night vision struggled to compensate. The facility around him hummed with power that made his teeth ache, a subsonic vibration that resonated through his bones and made his healing injuries flare with renewed pain. He stood in a corridor that stretched in both directions beyond the range of his lights, its walls covered in symbols that predated language itself. The architecture was biomechanical but degraded, as if organic components had died and been replaced with crystallized matter that held their shape through memory alone. Movement in the darkness ahead, multiple contacts converging on his position with coordinated precision. The Slayer activated his shoulder-mounted flamethrower, and the fire illuminated a nightmare. The hybrids that had reached this facility were no longer recognizable as xenomorphs or demons. They had transcended both origins and become something new, their bodies twisted into forms that incorporated elements of maker technology and ancient bioweaponry. They stood upright like men but moved with articulated grace that suggested dozens of hidden joints, and their skulls had split open to reveal crystalline structures that pulsed with captured argent light. They attacked without hesitation, their bodies flowing across walls and ceiling with equal ease, and the Slayer met them with the full arsenal of his fury. The corridor became a kill zone, fire and plasma, and explosive rounds turning the air itself into a weapon. But the hybrids here were different, their bodies incorporating adaptive armor that learned from each hit and redistributed damage across their entire structure. A ballista bolt that should have destroyed one's torso instead dispersed its energy through its entire body, leaving it wounded but functional. The Slayer adjusted, targeting joints and limbs, crippling rather than killing, and then finished the immobilized creatures with the crucible's blade. The facility fought him as well, its automated defenses recognizing his presence as a threat. Walls extruded blade-like protrusions that tried to impale him, Floors opened into pits that led to recycling systems filled with acid, and the air itself grew thick with spores that attempted to infiltrate his suit's filtration systems. He pushed forward through the assault, his medical warnings multiplying as toxins began to accumulate in his bloodstream despite the suit's countermeasures. Each step deeper into the facility brought him closer to the archive, and each step revealed more hybrids that had evolved beyond their original form. He found the birthing chambers 3 levels down, vast spaces where the facility's original purpose became clear. This had been a genetic laboratory, built by an intelligence that predated the current iteration of Hell, and it had been designed to create weapons from captured species. The hybrids had instinctively understood this purpose and had begun using the equipment, accelerating their own evolution through processes that would have taken millennia to occur naturally. The chambers were filled with cocoons, each one containing a hybrid undergoing transformation, their bodies restructuring at the cellular level. The Slayer destroyed them all. He fired the BFG into the heart of the chambers, the green sphere of energy expanding until it touched every cocoon in the space, and the resulting detonation vaporized everything within 50 meters. The facility screamed, its systems registering the loss of valuable specimens, and the remaining hybrids converged on his position with unified purpose. They came in hundreds, their bodies adapted for war and enhanced with abilities stolen from demons and makers alike. They breathed fire and teleported short distances, and struck with enough force to crack his armor plating. The battle consumed the facility, room by room and corridor by corridor, until the Slayer reached the archive's entrance. It was a door 50 feet tall and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, each one describing concepts that existed outside conventional physics. The hybrids had gathered here in force, their bodies forming a living wall between him and the door, and at their center stood something that should not exist. It was a queen, but one that had merged with the facility's core intelligence, her body now partially crystalline and radiating power that made reality itself bend in her presence. She had absorbed knowledge from the archive, had interfaced directly with whatever consciousness resided in the facility's depths, and that integration had transformed her into something that transcended her origins. She looked at the Slayer with eyes that held understanding and malice in equal measure, and when she spoke, her voice echoed in dimensions beyond sound. She told him that evolution was inevitable, that adaptation was the only true constant, and that his war against Hell had blinded him to the larger pattern. The hybrids were not invaders, but the next stage in a process that had been ongoing since reality first cohered from chaos. The Slayer responded by activating the crucible and charging directly at her. The blade met her crystalline armor and shattered, its energy field unable to penetrate material that existed partially outside normal space. The Queen retaliated with a psychic assault that bypassed his helmet's defenses and struck directly at his nervous system, causing his muscles to seize and his vision to white out with pain. He fell to one knee, his body convulsing, and the hybrids pressed their advantage, swarming over him with claws and tails that tore at his armor's weakest points. The Slayer forced himself to stand through sheer will, his body moving despite signals from his brain that insisted he was paralyzed. He dropped the crucible and drew the super shotgun, firing both barrels into the Queen's face at point-blank range. The impact didn't penetrate her armor, but it staggered her, breaking her psychic concentration long enough for him to recover. He grabbed a hybrid that was clawing at his back and used it as a shield, its body absorbing attacks from its kin, and then threw it into the Queen with enough force to knock her backward. He needed a different weapon, something that could bypass the Queen's defenses and strike at the fundamental level where her consciousness resided. The Sentinel hammer would work, but it was stored in his equipment pod and he had no time to retrieve it. The BFG had depleted its charge, killing the cocoons. The ballista was effective against the regular hybrids, but useless against crystalline armor. And the crucible, his most reliable weapon, lay deactivated on the ground where he had dropped it. The The Slayer looked at the archive door behind the Queen, at the symbols that described reality's deep structure, and understood what he had to do. Those symbols were not decorative. They were functional, part of a security system designed to keep the archive sealed against intrusion. If he could disrupt the pattern, if he could break the equations that held the door stable, the resulting dimensional collapse would erase everything in the immediate area, including the Queen and her remaining hybrids. It would also probably kill him, or at least scatter his consciousness across enough dimensions that recovery would be impossible. He calculated the acceptable casualties, measured his own life against the lives that would be lost if the hybrids successfully integrated with the archive's intelligence, and made his decision in the space between heartbeats. The Slayer drew a plasma grenade from his belt, armed it for maximum yield, and threw it directly at the door's center symbol. The Queen realized his intent and lunged to intercept, but she was too slow, her crystalline body too massive to accelerate quickly enough. The grenade struck the symbol and detonated, its energy interacting with the equations in ways the facility's original designers had never anticipated. The door began to collapse inward, its structure folding through dimensions as the security system failed catastrophically. The Queen shrieked as the gravitational distortion caught her body and began pulling her apart, her flesh tearing away from her crystalline skeleton in strips. The hybrids tried to flee, but the collapse was spreading, reality itself unraveling in a sphere that expanded at the speed of thought. The Slayer ran, his armor's servos screaming as he pushed them beyond their operational limits, and behind him the facility ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. He made it to the corridor junction before the collapse caught him, the gravitational forces tearing at his armor and pulling at his flesh. He felt his left arm dislocate as something grabbed it from a direction that should not exist, felt his ribs crack as pressure waves from multiple dimensions converged on his torso. His helmet's display went dark, its systems overloaded by trying to process sensory input from angles reality did not possess. He fell into darkness that was not absence of light, but absence of existence itself, and for a period that might have been seconds or centuries, he simply ceased to be. The Slayer woke on Phobos, lying in the crater where the first hive had been destroyed. His armor was melted in places, the metal fused to his flesh, and his body reported damage that should have been fatal. Both legs broken, internal bleeding in 3 organs, skull fracture that had exposed brain tissue before his healing factor sealed the wound. He tried to move and managed to roll onto his side, coughing blood that steamed in the thin atmosphere. Above him, the stars wheeled in their courses, indifferent to his suffering or his survival. A shadow fell across his face, and he looked up to see the seraph standing over him. The angel's expression was unreadable, but it knelt and placed one hand on his chest, and power flowed into him like liquid light. His bones knitted, his organs repaired, his armor began to restore itself through processes that violated thermodynamics. Within 60 seconds, he was whole again, though the memory of pain remained like an echo in his nervous system. The seraph helped him to his feet and spoke quietly, telling him that the collapse had been successful, that the archive and everything connected to it had been erased from Hell's dimensional structure. The hybrid infestation was over. Every creature, every egg, every trace of their existence had been purged. Hell would recover in time, its lost territories slowly regenerating as reality reasserted itself. But the cost had been significant. An entire layer of hell had been deleted, along with billions of souls and demons that had existed within its boundaries. The Dark Lord was furious, his power base diminished, and he would seek retribution against the Makers for allowing the situation to escalate. War was coming between heaven and hell once more, and this time it would be fought not over Earth but over the right to define reality's rules. The Seraph told the Slayer that he had earned rest, that he could return to his tomb and sleep until he was needed again, but the Slayer looked across Phobos toward Mars, toward the orbital stations where humans still lived and worked, and he shook his head. He had seen what happened when vigilance lapsed, had watched as a single crashed ship became an existential threat. There would be no rest. There would be no tomb. He would remain active, would continue to patrol the boundaries between dimensions, would stand ready for the next incursion. The Seraph accepted this decision with a nod and opened a portal back to the Mars orbital station. Before the Slayer stepped through, he looked back at the crater one final time. The resin structures were gone, burned away by the reactor collapse, but acid scars remained in the bedrock, permanent reminders of what had nearly consumed hell itself. Those scars would be visible for millennia, a warning to anyone who thought evolution could be controlled or contained. Nature would always find a way to adapt, to survive, to transcend its limitations. And when it did, when the next impossible threat emerged from the darkness, there would need to be someone willing to stand against it. The Slayer walked through the portal, leaving Phobos behind, and the stars continued their ancient dance overhead. In the depths of hell, in regions where reality had not yet fully stabilized after the Archive's collapse, something stirred in the void. It was small, barely visible even to instruments designed to detect dimensional anomalies. Just a single cell, a fragment of hybrid tissue that had somehow survived the erasure by existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It drifted through the void, dormant, but not dead, waiting for conditions that would allow it to begin growing again. Evolution never stopped, it only paused. And in the darkness between stars, between dimensions, between the spaces where reality forgot to enforce its rules, that single cell began to divide.